We begin a new series this morning. Let me pull the curtain back and maybe answer a question you've wondered about on occasion, which is, how does Pastor Chris pick what he talks about on Sunday morning? Well, in the summer, you actually pick what I talk about on Sunday morning, right? In our summer Q&A series, so that makes it easy on me. Of course, during Advent, it's pretty obvious what I'm going to talk about. During Lent, we tend to focus on Jesus or our own spiritual commitment and life. But you may not have picked up on it. Once every calendar year, I try to preach from the Old Testament. You might, if you've been a part of the KirkWood family for a while, recall, for example, a few years ago, we talked about Jonah, an extraordinary story in the Old Testament. That's when our worship decor team made their debut. Everybody remember the whale with the pool noodle spout? Yeah. Or you might recall, it was about a year and a half ago, we spent time talking about the first two chapters of Genesis. What is the creation story trying to say, and what is it very much not saying? Well, it's crucial that you and I as Christian people spend time in the Old Testament because it is also our story. I have become more convinced of this than ever being your pastor because of the presence of our dear Jewish sister, Cindy Williamson, who often we will remind each other, this is all our shared story. It is our Judeo-Christian heritage. So this year, our turn to the Old Testament is going to be to a part of the big book, big collection, known as Psalms in the Old Testament. And a specific part or set of those Psalms that we know as the Psalms of Ascent. This is Psalm 120 to 134. These are psalms that were put together to be prayed and sung by those in Israel who would go up 3 times a year to the capital city and the temple residence in Jerusalem for a big feast. So whether you're starting up north or down south, you would move in a caravan to Jerusalem 3 times a year for these celebrations. And as you did, these Psalms of Ascent would be the songs and prayers that you used. They're short, and the reason they're short is they weren't written down. You had to remember them. So they're catchy sometimes, and they're memorable, so that as you did this over the course of your lifetime, you would have many of them memorized by heart. But I also love the fundamental image of what these psalms are. These psalms are for pilgrims. These psalms are for people in transit, people on the move, going from one place to another. And that, of course, is our life too. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 says that all of us who are Christians on this earth are aliens and foreigners. We are people on the move. These are our pilgrim songs, too. So there are 15 Psalms of Ascent. We're not going to spend 15 weeks going through each one, but there is going to be a rhythm to this series, which is I'm going to preach on one Psalm of Ascent on a Sunday morning, and then during the next week, you're going to get to read the next one and spend time with it. So today, I'm going to talk about Psalm 120. Beginning tomorrow, you can read and reflect on Psalm 121. Next Sunday, I'm going to preach on Psalm 122. The next week, you'll read Psalm 123, and we will make our way through all of the Psalms of Ascent in about a month and a half, doing it that way. So we're going to begin today with the first Psalm of Ascent, Psalm 120. And I thought a good structure for today was to maybe let you in on how often I go about preparing sermons, which is to pay very close attention to what the text is saying in its cultural and historical setting, but then begin to ask questions of the text in response. So let's begin. This is how Psalm 120 begins. In my distress, I cry to the Lord so that he might answer me. The psalmist writes, the pilgrims sing, and the pilgrims pray. This makes me think, when I am in distress, is my first reaction to cry out to God? And if not, why not? And I suppose that probably leads to the next question, which is, deep down, who is it that I think is the answer to my distress? Is it going to be me, or is it going to be God? Distress, that word distress, is used over 20 times in the entire collection of Psalms, meaning that distress is not a rarity in life, it's commonplace. So it would seem like you and I need to think through our commonplace response to commonplace distress. And what is it? Perhaps you're like me, and you would admit that oftentimes, when I run into a challenging situation, a problem that vexes me, my first instinct is to try and figure it out myself. What resource do I need here? What expert can I consult? What phone call do I need to make? What email do I need to write? But the psalmist's instinct is none of that. In the moment of distress, the instinct of the psalmist's soul is to cry out to the Lord first. That speaks to an orientation of life that all of us as pilgrims need to have. And that orientation is one of dependence. This is how Asiri Fernando, a Sri Lankan theologian, puts it. If you're trying to get the geography, Sri Lanka is an island nation south of India in the Indian Ocean. He writes, in an age of self-sufficiency and one-upmanship, it may seem counterintuitive to talk about dependence. For many, dependence is a sign of undignified weakness. But for the Christian, however, dependence is everything. At the heart of sin is our independence from God. Likewise, our salvation is achieved on the bedrock of total reliance on God. As we mature in our faith, we will not grow less dependent on God, but more dependent on God. There is never a point at which we stand on our own 2 feet without God's empowerment, help, wisdom, and strength. End quote. That's an important anchor that holds us in the right place. The goal in life, regardless of age, regardless of how long you've been a Christian, is not to become more independent from God, not to cry out less to God when we encounter the distresses of life that are commonplace. No, in fact, it's the exact opposite. The goal is to become more dependent, more quick to cry out, more to throw our cares and needs on God's shoulders and then let him direct or give to us accordingly. And I do wonder, by the way, will our distress be resolved if we are unwilling to cry out? I suspect in some cases the answer is no. God is probably waiting in certain situations for you and I to exhaust ourselves in trying to fix things ourselves and finally give up, throw up our hands, and say, God, I can't do this. I need you. I wonder what distress in your life this morning is stuck in place simply because you are not crying out to God about it. Oh, but here's where the psalm starts to get really interesting. Beginning in verse 2. Deliver me, O God, from lying lips and from a deceitful tongue. Okay, so if I'd had everybody in the room, including myself, make a list of the top 4 distresses in your life today, there is no chance anybody would have said that lies and deception are in your top 4. I would think it would be things like physical challenges, financial challenges, perhaps a broken relationship that you hope will mend. But the psalmist says, Lord, I am in distress, and the first thing that I am in distress about are the lies and deceptions around me. This is not a one-off in Psalms. Lying and deception are mentioned in the whole collection of Psalms 32 times. That's more than 1 in 5 Psalms. And often, those deceptions and lies are connected with personal distress. You might think to yourself, wow, boy, the ancient world was a terrible place. How dishonest. Yeah. So, I read this week a summary book published by the American Psychological Association that put into one place all the recent findings about lying in American culture. You ready? So every one of us lies probably somewhere between 2 to 4 times a day, depending on how you define lies. Which means, as we are billiard balls vectoring off of one another on the billiard table of life, in any given day, 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 conversations that you have contain a lie or deception of some kind. More than half of Americans say that they lie to their family, spouse, or close friends on a regular basis. Now, if that has you really down on the moral turpitude of Americans, the author of this monograph, in an aside, said, yeah, don't worry. Just remember that 1 in 10 Americans say they would murder a stranger for $2 million. So, lies and deception are more a part of our everyday existence than you and I might be aware. But that then begs the question, what form do those lies and deceptions and dishonesties take? Well, the same monograph published by the APA answers that. The 2 most common forms of dishonesties that you and I deal with or inflict on others are deceptions meant to protect someone else, or deceptions meant to protect ourselves. And in both cases, they can be very harmful. Take the first case. Someone who is dishonest to you, maybe not telling you the whole story, maybe exaggerating, whatever. Someone who is dishonest with you because they're trying to protect you. On the one hand, sure, there's a good motive in there, but what's the downside? Well, Proverbs chapter 27, verse 17 says that as iron sharpens iron, one person should sharpen another person. In a world where we lie to protect one another, that verse becomes, as butter sharpens butter, no one sharpens anyone. And this is how often we deal with one another. We communicate back and forth to one another. It will be okay You and I can stay in relationship. We can be in the same church. We can be friends as long as you don't ever tell me anything that I don't want to hear. And the minute you do, our relationship will splinter. We have become a fragile people. And in so doing, we have become a shallow and immature people. Some of the worst lies are the lies people think that they are telling or withholding from you because they're trying to protect you. One of the best things you can do in your life, one of the best things I can do in my life, is ask people, especially those people I trust, tell me the truth. If I hurt your feelings, I want to know. If I misspoke, I want to know. If I came off like a know-it-all, I want to know. If you heard in my words anger or judgment, I want to know. Because you withholding that hurts me and hurts us. The second most common kind of lie or withholding is when we lie to one another to protect ourselves. This too is damaging. You can see that. If I fear that I tell you something that then you will judge or demean me for or cause you to take a step back from me, then I'm never going to tell you that thing. Which then means we are all playing a game of pretend. Vulnerability and openness become diminished between us because I'm afraid of how you will respond to what it is I'd like to tell you. Do you see how damaging lies can be? Even ones where I'm just trying to protect myself. There's an Old Testament scholar who writes about Psalm 120 and this verse in particular, James May, who taught at Union Seminary in Richmond, and he says, what you need to realize about lies and deceptions is that fundamentally they undermine the soul. Those deepest, richest parts of being human, they are undermined by the lies and deceptions that we take as normal or accept. Lord, I cry out in my distress, and one of my distresses is the way we tell half-truths to one another. We deceive each other. We hide from one another. And I tell people not to be honest with me. There is a second kind of specific distress that the author mentions. And this is in verses 5 to 7. What you're about to read here is metaphorical. It's not literal. I'll touch on that after I read it. Woe is me, because I live as an alien in Meshech and among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for war. Meshech is northwest Turkey, up by modern-day Istanbul. Kedar is the southeastern point of the Arabian Peninsula, down where modern-day Yemen would be. Israel and this author have never been to both places. But what the author is telling you is how they feel. That I am a person who wants God's peace in the world, and I feel like everyone around me, all the peoples and tribes around me, want the exact opposite. They love hostility. They yearn for conflict. They want war. And even when I try to speak up for peace, I am shouted down by those who love conflict and aggression instead, to the point that I feel like an alien in the world, to use the word in Psalm 120, verse 5. You and I are very fortunate. We live in a part of the world where we don't have to deal with literal war. Not in our communities, in our state, in our environs. There are other parts of the world that do. Where is it that you deal with the alienating effect of warmongering and hostility most? I think I'd bet my bottom dollar that it's in words. It's in the language that we share. It's in the language that we promote. It's in the language that our public personalities use. This is where you will experience most the violence you see here. Most of us gathered here as Christian people yearn for harmony and peace and unity. And sometimes when we leave this place, it feels like being an alien in the world because no one else seems to want that. And we cry out to God in our distress because these words of violence afflict us so, and we see the damage they do. If you've ever done any training in conflict resolution, invariably at some point you're going to run into something called nonviolent communication, which was popularized in the 1990s by a psychologist named Marshall Rosenberg. The opposite that we often experience in the world from nonviolent communication is violent communication. And violent communication, according to that study and book, sounds like this. Violent communication sounds like moralistic judgment. I demean you for the moral choices you are making that do not align with my value system, regardless of whether or not your conscience is clear about them. Violent communication is to use comparison to make yourself feel superior to someone else. Violent communication is to deny your own personal responsibility for your own actions and blame somebody else. Violent communication is to demean or demonize another group of people. Violent communication is to make your own desires a demand and to let those around you know, if I don't get what I want, you will pay for it. Our world is full of violent communication. And it is from that place that we, like the psalmist, cry out, Lord, deliver us from this distress. I don't know if it has struck you as I've worked through the bulk of Psalm 120 this morning, but it certainly struck me. That when you think about the distress caused by lying, deception, hostility, and a seemingly unending appetite for conflict, how could you not say that Psalm 120 is a psalm for our country right now? Lord, deliver us from the distress of lies, deception, conflict, and hostility, and those who celebrate those things. May we as God's people leave this place saying, there may be little peace in our nation, but we will be peacemakers. There may be those who use violent language against those with whom they disagree, but it will not be us. We will find common ground, common humanity, collaboration, and compromise. We will not share half-truths. We will not market propaganda as fact. No. We, of all people, will value seeking the truth and knowing that we as an individual do not possess all of it. Lord, in our distress. Lord, in the distress of lying and deception and hostility that seems to have overwhelmed our country, hear our cry. And may we be your people in this vital moment. Pray with me. Our good God, thank you for your written word that speaks over the millennia as loudly to us today as it did when it was first prayed and sung. Lord, this week, may we not hesitate to cry out first and foremost to you in our many distresses. Lord God, may we be mindful of the lies and deceptions we share and tell and receive and the distress they cause. And Lord, make us see that violent words have violent ends. And may we as your people have no part in it, and instead point the way to your peace. This, Lord, we ask for the sake of your kingdom, for our sake, and the sake of our country. Amen.